Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. This podcast explores how authors create a world that we can escape into. Join me as we demystify the magic that keeps us turning the page. I am here today with historical fiction novelist Elizabeth Fremantle to discuss her latest book, Disobedient. It's a gripping book about the real-life Renaissance artist Artemisia Gentileschi, who knows she is a great painter, but must defy convention to prove it. Women weren't supposed to be ambitious in 17th century Italy. They were supposed to marry, have babies, and take care of their family. Not Artemisia. She confronts horrible adversity, rape and torture, and turns these ordeals into triumphs, all at the age of 17. Liz talks about how she first came across Artemisia's fascinating story and why it took years for her to write about it. She also offers tips to aspiring writers of historical fiction not to let the facts overwhelm a good story. It's all about the story. We talked about lots more. I hope you enjoyed the show. I felt like I was right there in 17th century Rome, first on Via Margutta, which is a lovely light-filled street, and then in the Gentileschi's more modest house on the dark and cramped Via della Croce. You vividly portray how difficult it was to be a woman, especially an ambitious, uber-talented woman like the artist Artemisia Gentileschi, who wasn't content to live by the rules set out in patriarchal Rome. She wasn't properly recognized until 300 years later in the 20th century, in the late 20th century. Can you tell us how this book came into being and how you first became acquainted with Artemisia's talent and life story?
Artemisia has been on my radar for quite a long time. I know about her. I'm very interested in art history, and I'm always also looking for women who, from that period, I mean, we sort of loosely, I guess, call it the early modern period, who somehow have found their voice. So either through painting or writing or politics. And so I'd known about her because I'd seen her painting, or I'd seen reproductions of the Judith slaying Holofernes, which is such a striking and visceral, bloody painting. And you can't believe it's painted by a woman when you see it. You just think that's not possible. A woman at that time could have painted something like that, because there's no other painting really in that period of art that's quite so brutal, I think. Anyway, I knew the painting and I was, so kind of thrilled to discover that it was painted by a woman. But I'd never written anything set anywhere other than England. And that's kind of, what I was doing, what I was contracted to do. And there was going to be a big exhibition in 2020, a retrospective of Artemisia's work, all brought together at the National Gallery in London. And my daughter's friend is a young woman called Katie Hessel, and she was working on a book called The Story of Art Without Men, which is now out and has been incredibly successful. And I was listening to her talking on the radio about this exhibition of Artemisia's paintings that was coming up. And it just reminded me of her story. And her story is so astonishing. This story, the part of her story I've chosen to tell in my novel, is so astonishing because there are some really, really challenging obstacles she had to overcome to become the hugely successful painter that she was in her day. And so I was sort of listening to, there was Katie on the radio, and then I heard, there were articles and things, and I thought, I've got to do this book. I've got to do this book. I was contracted actually to write a novel about Afra Ben, who's a restoration playwright, female restoration playwright, and was a spy. I mean, she's an incredibly exciting figure, historical figure. But I sort of struggled to find my way into her story. I just couldn't quite find it. And I kept on, Artemisia kept on like chatting to me in my unconscious. And then It was 2020, COVID happened, lockdown happened, and it kind of threw everything in the air, and the exhibition was postponed. But I just couldn't stop thinking about Artemisia. And I think also because her story, to me, is very much a Me Too story. And there, I think all those stories, women were starting to talk about their experiences of abuse at the hands of men, which is largely what Artemisia's story is about, or partly what it is about. Somehow, everything kind of rose to the surface all at once in that lockdown year. So I just persuaded my agent and my editor that was the novel I needed to write. And they were cool with that. So hence, Disobedient came into being.
Fantastic. It's interesting when you say that you had to figure your way into a story. So when you're doing your historical fiction, is there something that you think, okay, I could write about this? I mean, it's clear with Artemisia, from what you write, it's a great story. But is it sometimes where you have something you really want to write about it clearly, but you just can't find how to make it a story for readers? It's missing something.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, my previous novel, The Honey and the Sting, it was meant to be about a particular historical figure. There was sort of a part that was about a man called John Felton, and the other part was meant to be about a woman called Frances Cook. And I wrote like 2 whole drafts and submitted it to my editor, and it just wasn't working. And so I had to cut Frances Cook out of it altogether. And she sort of morphed into 3 completely fictional female characters. And I used the male characters. There are 2 primary ones, the Duke of Buckingham, and one's John Felton, the man who eventually assassinates him. And they're men who are, I won't say what their relationship is, because that might ruin it. So Duke of Buckingham, I don't know if you've had Mary and George screening on Sky. We've had that recently it's about Buckingham and his mother. All these figures are incredibly entertaining. But I just couldn't make the 2 stories work properly together. So I abandoned poor Francis, and now it became something else. So sometimes that can happen. I mean, that was the first time that really happened to me. I tend to be able to identify a character once I've done a little bit of research. It's all about, I like there to be a certain amount of jeopardy in their story, because for me, that works in terms of narrative excitement. It needs, there are plenty of really incredible women, but their stories are quite quiet. And I don't really do quiet. I tend to want something that's much, much more full of rage and full of excitement. Yeah. So, and Artemisia is really perfect for that.
Perfect. Your book spans just 1 year of Artemisia's life. So much happened to her when she was just 17, a young girl. Were you tempted to write about her later life and career success, or did you always know the book would be limited to that 1 year?
I always knew it would be limited, because it was almost as if I saw the whole narrative, once I started researching. And though her later life is really interesting, and I really hope my novel will encourage people to look her up and see what she achieved. I mean, she was the first woman to be admitted to the Academy of Art and Design in Florence. I mean, hugely prestigious. And she was enormously successful in her lifetime. And of course, she disappeared because she was female, really. But, it's an extraordinary story. She lived an extraordinary life after the afterlife of my novel. But I researched all of that because I think her later story was really important to the characterization of her early story, how she was as a young woman.
It was so heartwarming to read the end, but I won't. I don't want to give it away, but it's so hard when you do these interviews. I love your 1-word title, Disobedient, and brief chapter names like Judas' nipples, St. Agatha's breasts, the handkerchief. In just a few words, you summarize what the reader should focus on. In a similar vein, can you summarize the theme of this novel?
Oh my goodness, you've really put me on the spot there, Elaine. I'd say it's turning adversity into gold. What she does is she turns the enormous difficulties she experiences into something better and something triumphant. So triumph, not through adversity, but from adversity.
That's great. Yeah. And it's very good because of how she survives the whole Tassi thing, thinking.
Yeah.
Or the punishment with her hands.
Yes, absolutely. The torture. I mean, it's extraordinary. She's forced to undergo torture as part of a legal procedure. And she might lose the use of her hands.
I was
It's
thinking that.
extraordinary. Yeah. Yeah. And that really happened. I didn't make that up.
Is Artemisia the first woman painter to tackle, as far as you know, visceral biblical subjects? Women weren't allowed to for so many reasons. They needed to be pious and virtuous. And yet paintings often depicted them as sensual creatures with men ogling them.
Yes. I mean, really, your point about men ogling them, I think one thing I'd like to say about Artemisia's work is that she is the first female painter to shift the male gaze. You look at her work and you experience the female's perspective. And that was completely new, completely revolutionary. Her figures, even when they're nude, you're not looking at them it's not a pleasurable experience. You look at them, you can feel their discomfort at their nudity. That there's a very famous painting, Susanna and the Elders, where this young naked woman is another biblical story, being ogled by these rather sinister older men. And in the biblical story, they are threatening her. They're saying, you've got to sleep with us, or we will tell the community that you've slept with us anyway. And the punishment for adultery, that she was a young married woman, the punishment for adultery in those days was to be stoned to death. So it's a really sinister painting, and lots of previous painters had tackled, they painted Judas. They're all over the galleries. You can see them, Judas, these naked women, and they're rather titillating. Whereas Artemisia's Susanna she's pushing away, she's making a barrier with her hands against the men and their gaze. And she just looks frightened, and you feel that with her. And I think, I hadn't seen paintings prior to that do that with the gaze, that shift the gaze. So I think in terms of that, she was revolutionary. But you mentioned also the visceral, violent depictions, which we particularly think of the Judas slaying Holofernes, which in Artemisia's depiction of it, it's two enormously strong women holding down a man and hacking his head off. There's nothing that tries to conceal that act. It's absolutely, the head is front and center, right? Your eye line is taken directly to that image of this head being hacked off, this terrified male face. And these extremely efficient women, it's really chilling. And I haven't been able to discover, let alone another female painter, but another painter other than Caravaggio, who painted the same scene very differently about 10 years before. I haven't been able to find another painter who, up until Artemisia's, had also tackled that subject head on. We find a lot of, the two women running away from, they'd gone into the enemy camp and hacked off. He's a Syrian general, and they were besieging the Jewish village, and the two women running away with the head discreetly tucked in a basket. You sometimes see a little bit of sort of rather greenish flesh and maybe a bit of beard and a nose and a bit of gore dripping through the basket, but it's all quite tidily and, is a little bit discreet. There's nothing discreet about this. Women just simply wouldn't have dared paint something like that. So, her choices are so bold. I think there were other female painters. There were a handful of very good and quite well-known painters, but they were all portraitists. And some very, very good. They paint lovely family portraits, really beautiful. Lavinia Fontana. Oh, she's got quite a difficult name. Somebody, Anguissola, isn't it? I can't remember her other name. And, really very, very capable painters, talented women, but they weren't doing what Artemisia did, and certainly not at the age Artemisia did
right, because she did it at 17. Yeah, wow.
She was so young. Her Susanna was painted age 17, and her Judith, she painted 2 versions of the Judith. There is some dispute about when they were painted, but they were painted pretty soon. Certainly one of them was painted pretty soon after the Susanna.
Looked up Caravaggio's one, and it's so different. I mean, the woman is much younger, quite attractive. Also, the position of the woman is so impractical in terms of slaying a man. She's sort of standing back. Wouldn't you be thrusting forward? It's a violent act.
The chapter in which we encounter that painting is the one titled Judith's Nipples. Because the eye of the viewer in that painting is drawn to the very tight kind of piece of white cloth across the woman's breasts, and you just see the nipples. It's so, it's like this woman, she sort of seems astonished that she's cut off this man's head. There seems to be very little intention there.
Exactly.
And kind of shocked, and she seems physically incapable of doing it. And yet the eye is not drawn to the decapitation at all. It's drawn to her breasts, which,
Exactly.
I've not got much more to say about that.
It's true. Do you think Artemisia was as talented as Caravaggio?
I personally do. Yeah, I do. And I think she should be as well recognized as him as a painter. And, one day I hope my novel helps that a little. It helps make people take her seriously as a painter.
Apart from Artemisia, your other characters are equally well portrayed. What do we know about her father, Orazio, and her tutor and painter, Tassi?
Well, Orazio, he was very good and reasonably successful painter. I mean, he was certainly more famous than she was for hundreds of years, ironically. And he taught her to paint. But if you look at their work side by side, and I was lucky enough to see in the London exhibition, the postponed one, which when I finally did get to see, they had a number of his works put side by side with hers. And you see, he's a really capable painter. He's a man with great talent, but he's not got that extra spark that she's got. There's something about her work that, you can really feel the characters that she's painting. They have real life, whereas his work, there's a passivity to it. It's beautiful, it's decorative, but the figures are flat in some way, whereas hers are really in 3 dimensions. So we don't know a huge amount about his life story. And we know, or it's supposed he was friendly with Caravaggio, that they were comrades. And there is this, well, I found it was an anecdote really, that Caravaggio and I found this in a book about Rome, stories of Rome, that Caravaggio and he had taken Artemisia to this execution when she was 6. And I use that in the novel. We don't know if that really happened. But it seems that Caravaggio was a figure who was in and out of the studio where Artemisia was growing up. Her mother had died, so her father raised her and her 3 brothers. And of course, her brothers none of them became painters. So I kind of imagined this Orazio feeling somehow that God was kind of playing some awful trick on him to give all the talent to his daughter and nothing to his sons, that somehow it was difficult for him to reconcile with that, because what good in his mind is having a daughter with all that talent? Because she's female, she's got to marry, she's got to have children. She's not going to be a painter. Well, she showed him. She proved him wrong.
She did.
And I thought that was really, really interesting in terms of the dynamics between them and how I imagined Orazio must have felt being in that situation, and how at once proud, but also very, very jealous of her talent.
And Tassi?
Well, Tassi, yes. I mean, I know him really from the court case. There's his testimony, so we hear his voice. Most of his testimony was a pack of lies. So we think, well, he was an incredibly duplicitous man. He seems to have been very striking, a physically good-looking man. And he was an incredibly accomplished painter of trompe-l'oeil. So if you imagine those ceilings in Roman churches where, you see and it looks like the sky and it looks like balconies going up and up and up forever, he was an absolute master at that, which for me was this wonderful parallel between the work he was creating, these extraordinary architectural kind of visual deceits, if you will, and his character, which matched that, so for me, it was really interesting to build him as a character from what I have seen of his work.
Right.
And yes, he's very, very famous for his architectural pictures.
It's funny. Yeah. The art really informs the character.
I think so. I mean, when you've got a body of work you can look at, you can really build a character from that. I feel it says so much about an individual.
Yeah. God, he was evil. And then her husband, Piero.
Well, Piero,
future husband.
Yeah. I mean, he is largely a fictional invention. She did marry a man of that name, Pier Antonio Stiatesi, who was from Florence and was related to the Stiatesis, who were great friends of the Gentileschis. So that's rooted in history. We don't know anything much else about him. All we do know is that from their marriage, from letters from their marriage, letters of his and letters of hers, that they had a very long and happy marriage. He supported her in her painting. She was the breadwinner, and he helped her get her commissions, and he helped her source her pigments. And so, they kind of turned the kind of marital structure on its head. And they had an unconventional setup. She had a long affair with a man who was a friend of both of theirs. There are letters from Pier Antonio to him and letters from her to him, all terribly friendly and matter of fact, which made me wonder if they didn't have some kind of libertine marriage, that completely kind of open-minded, something that's even unusual today. It seems to have been the case. And so I characterized Piero from that. In the novel, he's homosexual, and which makes complete sense. And I also wanted her to have this profound friendship. I mean, it is a friendship that's really important at the heart of the novel, but for that friendship to be one of mutual admiration that wasn't to do with, it wasn't a sexual relationship. It wasn't a romantic friendship. It was all about mutual respect and a real kind of, they are soulmates, but they're not soulmates romantically.
No, I love that. It was like some light.
Yeah.
Some light in the hard book. You wrote this book during COVID, so I assume you didn't go to Italy to do some of your research. What were some of the most helpful sources to get into the real life and times of 17th century Rome?
Okay, well, because it was a new territory for me. Give me the Tudor court, give me the Jacobean court. I can do that standing on my head. This was completely new. So to find myself stranded in London in lockdown with the British Library shut, which was really kind of put a spanner in the works as well. But in lockdown in Italy, there were a number of people who did these incredible, they filmed drone footage of Rome, the empty streets of Rome. And they were on YouTube. And that was incredible for me. It was like, well, one, seeing the city empty, which you never get to see because it's always absolutely teeming with people.
Right.
And you know, the modern city is not the same as that city that I write in my book. There are some of the bare bones of it still there, but it's a completely different place. So it's really important not to be too bogged down in the kind of the visual city, the visual modern city. You know, it was different. It will have smelt different. It will have looked different. You know, there would have been, you know, horses everywhere, you know, horse dung, the smell of dung.
Yeah.
It would have been very different. It's really an act of imagination that you have to employ to recreate that city of 1611. And there are maps. I love maps. And there are these fantastic maps. There's one from about 10 years before 1611. So I think it's the last couple of years of the 16th century, one map. And then there's one map, which is about 10 years after. And they are both, those maps are online and you can they have a Zoom facility, so you can zoom in. So I kind of worked out what buildings were there and what weren't there. Rome was undergoing a huge transformation in that period. It was building work everywhere. All these buildings that now are so familiar were being built or were to be built. I mean, so you think of things like the Spanish Steps, you think, well, that's Rome, you know, they're a really important landmark in Rome. They weren't there then.
Oh,
and so these maps really, really helped me chart that old city. Yeah. And I just had to use my imagination. I did all sorts of things, like looked at the migratory patterns of birds to work out what birds would have been in the city at what time of year. And the internet is an amazing tool for things like that. And there are good history books, you know, sort of social history. So books about, you know, academic books about quotidian life in Italian cities in that period. And those are incredibly helpful. They give you a sense of what people were doing every day, which is really important for building a realistic kind of backdrop for the story. Yeah.
So in your writing process, do you take tons of notes and reading first and then do an outline? And then at what point do you start actually writing the book? How does that work?
I think, I mean, a lot of my research is text-based. So I do a huge amount of reading. And luckily, given the British Library was shut, I'd known I wanted to do this book, and I had already got in the main books I wanted to read. So thank heavens for that. And I ended up buying a lot of books and things on, you know, books on painting, books on, pigments, the cost of pigments, how much paintings cost, the trade, and yes, all the scoodies, yeah. So all that was really important. I read it all and I make copious notes. And then there's a moment at which I say, okay, I'm going to start writing now. And I put it all aside and I just start. I usually kind of have a vague map of a series of stepping stones, really.
In your head?
I write that down. So it's like almost like a bit like a list.
Okay, yeah.
So I know where it needs to go. You know, so I know how I want it structured. And I knew I wanted the major Tassi incident to be about the center part of the book. And, you know, but things evolve. So I don't like to be too prescribed, because once I start writing, it takes on a life of its own. And I like to allow that to happen.
Fantastic. Is there, I mean, maybe you've already touched on it when I asked you how you find your way into a story, but is there any advice you would give to an aspiring historical fiction novelist?
I think really choose your choose your story really carefully, and don't think you have to put everything you know about that person into it, because you can become very, very bogged down in the facts. And I think sometimes a story can be kind of, it needs to breathe and it needs to flow. So I think it'll all be there because they're things you know. So do the research, but then don't be determined to put everything in and show how much research you've done. if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, don't get bogged down by the facts. The story needs to flow.
Don't think you have to show the reader that you've done your stuff. If, the novel can be really pared down and it's still apparent that you've done your stuff, that it's all about the story. It's all about the characters. That's what you need to focus on rather than, what kind of cheese they were eating. Although you need to know that because there will be a moment when you'll know, you'll have a wheel of cheese being unloaded from a cart and you'll know what cheese that is because you've done your research. But yeah.
It's sort of like when I think of an actor preparing for a role, they know the whole life story of that actor.
Yeah.
A character.
Yeah.
But you don't see it on screen. It just helps inform them.
Absolutely. And I do tend to write little backstories and things. I spend a lot of time writing around my characters. So finding their voice, their own individual voices and understanding their backstories that will not be in the novel. So that's always really, really important part. And then working out what mode I'm going to use to tell the story. I mean, more often than not, I use present tense, third person, most stories really work well for me in that, because I feel like a historical story has more immediacy if it's told in the present tense. I know you do get people saying, oh, I don't really like the present tense for history, but, actually it should be invisible anyway. People should be reading it and not really thinking about what tense it's in if it's done well. So I always hope I achieve that. If it's in the present tense, your characters don't have the benefit of hindsight. Everything's happening with an immediacy. They don't know what's going to happen to them. We don't know what's going to happen to them. So we're kind of with them as readers. So I really, really like that. I tried my most recent novel, which I'm working on at the moment. I wrote a whole draft in the past tense, and I changed it all. I changed it all to the present tense.
And is it much better?
Much better, much better. Yeah, yeah. For me, it really, really works. And it doesn't work for everybody. Mostly people tend to write in the past tense. But
I liked it. I felt immersed immediately.
Yeah, I feel it does do that. It takes you there. And I think there's not that sort of knowing edge that you have with if a protagonist is writing. I always think if it's in the past tense, they're writing it from memory. So they know what's going to happen and that impacts the way they would tell their story. So, I want them to not know anything.
So what are you working on now?
I'm working on a book so the first chapter it's a kind of prequel. It's also set in Rome. It's set in 1598 and 99. And it is strongly linked to the first chapter of Disobedient. It is about Beatrice Cenci, who is the woman being executed in the very first chapter of Disobedient.
Right.
It's her story. And it's an extraordinary, I mean, if anything, it's an even more kind of viscerally brutal female story. It's another story that's about a situation of quite extreme domestic abuse. And Beatrice and her family plot the death of the patriarch. And it's a really grim story, and it's a true story, and it's very shocking. And she's an extraordinary figure. She's quite well known in Italy, but she's not really well known elsewhere. There have been operas about her. She's the kind of, tragic figure that has been, people who write operas are drawn to.
So we won't get the happy ending that we got with.
Well, I always try and find something of a happy ending, that there's a thread of hope. I'm not one for a great romantic happy ending ever anyway, but I do like there to be a thread of hope. And so there is a thread of hope.
Okay. Throughout the book, you have quotes from Artemisia, such as, "You will find the spirit of Caesar in this soul of a woman," or "I'll show you what a woman can do." Where were these quotes? Did she, in her journal, or where did you find them?
They're from her letters. So from her letters in later life. And, she's convincing potential patrons of what she's capable of, so she, in her letters, they're persuasive letters saying, if you think a woman can't do this, well, I'll show you. Yeah. So that's where they come
They're
from.
good.
Yeah.
They're very empowering. And, well, she's a writer.
Yeah. And that's who she was. She was so absolutely confident about her abilities. And I have, shown her thus in the novel. Even as a young woman, she knows how talented she is. She knows she's more talented than her father, even at a really early age. And she has that absolute conviction about what she's able to do. And she really, really wants to be one of the greats and believes she can be, though she's a woman. And I mean, I admire that so greatly. And so those quotes are an echo of that spirit. Yeah.
Yeah. Her self-belief. It's fantastic. Your novel, The Queen's Gambit, about Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr, is appearing as a film with Jude Law and Alicia Vikander.
Yeah,
Vikander, thank you, in June. Were you involved in the film at all?
I was a bit, actually. So the film, I have to say, the book is Queen's Gambit, not The Queen's Gambit. Then, because The Queen's Gambit is the novel by Walter Tevis about the woman who plays chess.
Right.
And of course, everything became quite confused by the success of that. And so the name of the film has been changed to Firebrand, which is a title I love. And a new edit of the novel is being released under the title Firebrand. It's essentially the same novel, but I've gone back in and I've given the text more room to breathe. I've just tidied it up a bit. So that's kind of exciting. But I was quite involved. Often the writer of the novel isn't particularly involved in the process of the film being made. But the producer, Gabrielle Tanner, was really, really wanted me to feel like I was part of what she called the film family, which was really lovely. So I had dinners with the director and with the actors and lots of meetings. And she wanted me to talk to them about how I had conceived the novel, what I felt about the characters. And so that was I really, really enjoyed, being welcomed into that world. And I visited the set a few times. It was just fantastic. Yeah, really, really
You
exciting.
met Jude Law, I assume.
I did meet Jude Law, yes, a few times. Yeah.
Henry VIII. And he plays Henry VIII.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen any clips. There are some trailers because it came out last week in France. So there are some trailers now. So any Google search, you'll be able to see Jude's Henry. He really went there. That's what I'm going to say. Okay. And Alicia Vikander, you might know her. She won a Best Supporting Oscar for the Danish Girl.
Oh, right. And James Bond. I feel like I've seen her in a James Bond.
I don't know if she's been in a James Bond. She was in Ex Machina. She played a kind of extremely beautiful robot. She's a Swedish actress. I mean, astonishingly talented and really has all the kind of coolness of Catherine Parr, who really had to operate in an extremely dangerous situation and not show anything on the surface. So she's like ice and he's like fire. And my God, they make quite, a combination together. It's a terrifying film. It takes a part of my book. There's a particular part of the plot, which is a plot on Catherine's life. The factions at court, it's all political and complex, and it takes that story. And, it does some things that it kind of sometimes is a bit fast and loose with the historical story. But in the essence of the characters are really true to me. I really love it. And I love it because it's quite different from my book. That my book's much more expansive. It covers a greater period in time. So it was such a thrilling thing to have that happen.
Oh, I can't wait to watch the film and read the book. I need to do so much.
Yeah. Well, I'll make sure you get sent a book.
Thank you. Is there anything similar between Artemisia and Catherine Parr? What sort of women protagonists are you drawn to?
I'm really glad you asked that question because it occurred to me when I was, the Disobedient was kind of coming into life, and Firebrand was also simultaneously coming into life. It made me, and I went back and I did the new edit of Queen's Gambit to become Firebrand. So I revisited Catherine Parr, and the parallels between the two women are astonishing, actually. And it was almost as if I'd sort of come full circle. Artemisia is much, much younger. Catherine Parr is 31 at the beginning of the novel. And she's a twice widowed, grown-up intellectual woman. She's a writer. People don't really know that. She's a writer and a published writer, 3 times published writer. They're both women wanting to be heard in a world where women are supposed to be silent. And though they come from completely different class, though Catherine Parr was actually she was not from the nobility. She was from a kind of a well-to-do family, but they were kind of courtiers. But she became Queen of England. Whereas I sort of think of Artemisia, she comes from a, artisan family, but she does become a kind of queen of sorts. She becomes a kind of queen of the world of art in her time. But they both overcame extraordinarily dangerous obstacles. They both managed to sort of understand how to work the patriarchy in their favor. And they both made themselves heard and are still heard through the centuries. So there are lots of parallels. There's no wonder I was drawn to both those women, because those are my concerns. And, all my work tends to deal with those kind of concerns.
Well, on a more personal level, in your author's notes, you tell us how Artemisia's story is quite personal for you, both as a reason you didn't want to write the book and then ultimately did. Can you tell us a bit about that and how watching Christine Blasey Ford testify about Brett Kavanaugh in front of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 2018, so 6 years ago, spurred you on with writing this book?
Yeah. Artemisia is a rape survivor, a survivor of violent rape, I should say. And so am I. At a similar age, I was a teenager. I was raped by 6 men and left for dead. So that's a very, something I've had to come to terms with over my extremely long life, longer than I care to admit to. It's something, that was one of the reasons why I felt I wasn't able, because I knew she was an extraordinary figure, but I thought, it's too close to home. I don't know if I can live with her story for long enough to write the novel, to really, really engage with that. And then a lot of women were coming out and telling their stories, the whole kind of Me Too movement. But I was watching Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, and it had a profound effect on me. I was astonished at her courage, actually, because it's so easy to shove those events that happen to many, many, many women when they're very young. And they think, well, no one's going to believe me, so I may as well not tell anyone. I'm just going to deal with it in my own way. Or people will judge me. People will think somehow I'm spoiled or ruined, or, they will judge me negatively. You live with a lot of shame. And crazy to look at it in that way, to think you feel shame. But it's a familiar thing, I think, for rape survivors to feel, to sort of turn in on themselves, to attack themselves. So seeing the way she spoke about her experience with such courage, and, we all believed her. And yet.
And
it made me very angry, that. And it put me in touch with, instead of the shame, it put me in touch with the rage, actually. And so when I kind of revisited Artemisia's story, I kind of thought, okay, this is something, if all these other women have the courage to kind of to stand up and tell these stories, then, I can do it. And, I think I had come to a point in my life when I felt able to do it as well. And it was an extraordinarily cathartic process.
I was wondering.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very much so.
Because you really write how she goes outside of her body and she realizes she can always paint. And then she makes those characters the heroine of the painting, not the victim.
Yeah. So yes, it was very personal, that, to me. Yeah.
You write so well. Everything always seemed to go back to your premise. You're constantly reminding readers of, adversity or triumph from adversity. You do it throughout. So I felt like it was a very tight book, because it really works on that one theme throughout, without even the nightingale that keeps reoccurring. I read that that's based on what is it, a biblical tale?
It's a story from Ovid, actually. Yes. No, and actually there was a lot more of that. I mean, I love that you say it's tight, because that was really my intention. My early draft was not tight at all.
Oh,
I had a lot more. It was a lot baggier, and I had a lot more of Orazio's story, actually. But yes, and I had a lot more of these stories from Ovid in there, and I kind of cut them back, because I just wanted them to work symbolically. And for them, people who knew those stories, they would see that and they think, I know what that's about. But I'll quickly précis the story of the nightingale. So I first came across it in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and he has the sound of the nightingale. And he takes that from Ovid and from the story of Philomela and Procne. It's a really, really grim story, so brace yourself. So Procne marries King Tereus. These are two princesses from, the ancient world. Procne is married to Tereus and is taken overseas to be with her husband. And Philomel misses her sister so much, she wants to go and join them for a bit. So Tereus comes to collect her, and they go back. And instead of taking her to the palace, he takes her to the woods and rapes her. She says, I'm going to tell everybody what you've done. I'm going to cry from the rooftops. I'm going to, everybody will know what you've done. And so he cuts out her tongue and then imprisons her in a building hidden away in the forest. So she will not be silenced. And so she embroiders the story of what happened to her on a tapestry. So, I mean, it's a wonderful symbol, because she uses the symbol of female craft, the loom, to tell her story. So I saw that as, it's like Artemisia. She uses her painting to tell her story.
Right.
So for me, and, I use my novel and Artemisia's life to tell my story and the story of, that's why it's dedicated to all the survivors, because those stories, they've got to be heard. And anyway, so Philomel's sister Procne finds her and sees the tapestry, knows what's happened, and she takes her revenge on her husband. And then they are all turned into birds, and Philomel is turned into a nightingale.
Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful. It's always like beauty and brutality next to each other.
Yeah. And for some reason, those are the stories that I'm drawn to, that they're dark, but there's some kind of richness about life in those stories, I think.
I think so too. Well, thank you very much. That's the end of my questions. I think this will be really I think people will find this really interesting.
Well, I hope
really
so.
Appreciate it.
I hope so. It's been a great pleasure, Elena.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to be in touch, you can find me on my website or Substack. Bye for now.